Before the break, we did our first SSF. And now we have one model, and we looked at it, and we know there's some variables are significant, others are not, and now there's always this process of building different models, evaluating them, selecting the right one, and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to show you exactly how to build the right model, but I'd like to show you some of the building blocks that you can use to come up with your own model. The general recommendation is to put as much thought as you can up front into this. So come up with very clear ideas as to what variables should have an impact and in which way. Do a mental model, what is happening for each variable, how it is affecting the movement, by looking in the literature, talking to other experts, coming up with ideas, and develop a few alternative models rather than hoping that the data will guide you to the right model. Okay, so that's the big recommendation. And now we'll look at some building blocks that can help you to decide what to do. So one of the things that happens often with spatial predictors is that they're collinear. So if you look at the different maps and then you calculate the correlation between your maps, then you'll find that they're not independent. So we can do this here when we look at our different environmental variables. We see that some are pretty highly correlated. For example, elevation and the distance to water, which is not super surprising because water tends to be further down. And a lot of papers have been written as to explain why this can be a problem then in estimating your parameters and how to deal with it. And one option to dealing with it is that if there are several that are correlated, you just take one. Yeah? There's a paper by Carsten Dorman that discusses all sorts of aspects of this. First, what is the problem, and then discusses some of the options to dealing with it. And then one that is suggested is that if you have the correlation that are more than 0.7, then you just take one of them. And then if you observe that, like here, which one do you pick? Well, if you had developed your ideas, what you want to test and what you think is important up front, then you just pick the one that is more relevant to your study. And if you don't know, then one option to do this is that you do variable selection. So you take the AIC to pick the one that you use. And that's what we'll do here. So we fit two models, one where we exclude elevation and one where we exclude distance to water. And then we look at the AICs. And then we see that the model that includes elevation has much lower AIC, so we would pick the elevation rather than distance to water. Yeah. What you see here implicitly is if you want to use the AIC, at least perhaps this is not anymore the case, but earlier on you would have to select specifically the model object inside the output of fit-Silogit, when you could test whether this is still the case, because what fit-Silogit gives us back, as I said earlier, it's richer than the output of the pure Silogit, but it contains the model as one element in the slot model. And so if you want to do things that, if we want to use methods that were written for a pseudologit model like the AIC, then we have to pick it there. Okay. So now this would be our new model. And then when we look at the summary, so one thing that you can do once you've fitted a model, you might want to have sort of a minimum model that where you throw out the stuff that is not that important. Yeah. And all I wanted to show you here is how you can then, by using AIC, can get to a smaller optimized model. And so here I do this more or less by hand by looking at the parameters that we have here, and then by throw out the least significant variable, and then check with AIC where I should stop. So here it seems that slope is not contributing much, so we throw this out, and now we have something that we cannot really reduce further, because these guys we should have in there to correct for the proposal distribution of the step of the movement model. So this would be then now our final model. Yeah, it's just backward stepwise selection that I'm doing here. I prefer it if you designed upfront a small set of models and then picked one of those rather than simply going backward from a rich model. I guess I'll stop. I'll skip the model checking bit here now, and rather look at what we can do once we have the model. And one thing that we had done earlier, and that the RSF is really good at, it is creating a habitat map, sort of showing a map where you say, well, this is what the animal likes, and this is what it doesn't like so much. And we can do the same thing also with an SSF. And this is what's happening with this code here. This is, I think, not yet in AMT. So there's a little function that would calculate this for you. We can't see much on this big map. So we zoom in, and we get this here. So our model was simple in that it had only elevation as a predictor, and what else? How did I call this? So it's another version I'm using here. It still has slope, elevation, mean NDVI, etc. So it has quite a number of environmental layers, and this is what it would produce. It still doesn't have this effect of crossing the river, so that's why we get also a lot of stuff here. The thing is now, in RSF, this would be proportional to the probability of actually finding the buffalo there in the long run if there was no home ranging. If Scylla at some point decided, I'm not doing home ranging anymore, I just run around, then the map that would you get there would be directly proportional to the probability of finding the animal there. Here it's slightly different. So this is related to the probability of finding it. So there's a monotonic relationship, but it's not one-to-one the probability of finding Scylla there in the long run. In order to get that, we actually have to simulate the movement of Scylla for a very long time. And the reason is that while this is indeed the kind of preference that Scylla would have for a given step, the actual movement is then dependent on this plus the movement kernel. So Scylla would only ever see at any given step a small part of this landscape, and that's why it might not be as often in certain areas as you would expect directly from this map. So the next section is on how can we integrate a bit more realism in our modeling. And one of the things that I was initially very fascinated by, and it's still something that I think is relevant, is the temporal variation in selection and also in movement behavior. And what we see here is now first the mean of the NDVI at the end of steps, of the realized steps, as a function of time of day. Well, there isn't much of a pattern, but you could, I mean, there could be that it's going for things and here we see something that is more striking. So you have here the step length distribution as a function of time of day. And what do we seem to see there? Yeah. This cake is worse than lunch. So, you know, there seem to be times when it's moving more and then times when it's moving less. Yeah? And I guess many organisms will have this phenomenon that during certain periods of time they move more than at others. And this may or may not be important for the question that you ask, but if you want to integrate that, then you can. And this is how. So, yes.
Does it matter if it's in UTC or the local time?
It matters where the peaks are. The phenomenon in it by itself should be the same. It's just shifted. And yes, I mean, it's a good point. One should look at this in a time zone that makes sense, yeah, to more easily interpret this. But in the end, it would, I mean, even if you did it in the wrong one, you could still fit something, but then you'd have to translate it later on into the one that you're interested in.
Okay.
Yeah. So, because what we will do is we will fit a model that is periodic. Yeah, because we want to make sure that what happens here is again the same thing that happens there, because there shouldn't be something happening, but the behavior shouldn't change suddenly at one point just because it's now midnight. Yeah, so what happens at midnight should be the same thing what happens then at 0 hours. And that is what I show you here, how to do that. So you have the model as we had it before. So we have elevation, we have the mean NDVI, and now we are interested in, well, does it change the selection for against NDVI as time of day? And for doing that, we add this explanative variable, which is an interaction between this, what we're interested in, the selection for mean NDVI, and periodic spline, that's the P, there's for periodic, spline of the variable hour. And this is how complex the spline can be. And then we have to tell it at what scale things are periodic. And for the hour, it's now 24. So hour 0 should get the same value as hour 24. You can do the same thing on an annual basis. And then you have, say, time of year, and then you have 0 and 365. And this code, which is a bit ugly, serves to get the confidence intervals for our prediction of the selection of NDVI as a function of time. So I just run this so that we then see, because I mean you see that the confidence intervals are rather wide, so I really urge you to add them here, because otherwise this looks always super funky, but is not necessarily very meaningful. So what we see here is we have time of day, about 24 hours, and this is then the preference for the mean NDVI. And we had earlier seen that on average, over a whole day, there's a preference for it. Now we see that there is, and I don't know which time zone we're in, that's a very good remark. At 15 hours of this time zone, they would rather go to a place where it's lower, where there are lower NDVI values. And this is something that I would now go on and explore more. Can I understand this? Is this really something that makes sense, or is it just because I looked at so many different potential patterns that something comes up at some point? Yeah, but I think the selection for resources that they vary over time at timescales of a day or a year is something that is recurrent and that can be important. I mean, for our case with the disturbance, so if you have a map of disturbance and that is static, but you know that there shouldn't be actual humans running around at midnight, by fitting something like this and then seeing that the birds do not avoid it during the night and they avoid it during the day, then that would be an indication that actually there's something going on that makes sense. Yeah. So just to give another motivation for why such an analysis could be useful, and so you have some code there to come back to. The next part is also perhaps something to come back to, because what I show there is how you calculate the actual step length distribution and the actual turning angle distribution for your animal, given your step selection function. So we said earlier that the parameter estimates that you see in the summary, they describe the change relative to the proposal distribution. If you now want to get the parameters to actually calculate the mean step length and stuff like that, then the following code is what you need to do here. You stop me when you say, I want to see this. Yeah, it's just that I feel it's 4:30 and because I'd like to spend some time with this here. This is how we can simulate with the model. So once we have our SSF model, which is here in this case M3. Let's look at M3 again. M3 contains elevation and mean NDVI as environmental predictors. We might now want to see where would Scylla end up in the long term if it was behaving according to this model. And to do that and simulate it for 500 steps, this is all we need. Let's look at what's going on. The first thing is setting the seed. Do you know why we want to do that? Have you come across this?
So we all get the same results.
We all get the same results, and you yourself get the same result the next time you do this. Yeah? Because it's quite frustrating when they get this beautiful path and you copied it, and then for whatever reason you have to do a revision or whatever, and you can't, for lack of it, recreate it. That's not nice. Yes?
This is a little bit out, maybe out of the context, but we have set seed at 6, at 2, at 23. How you define that number?
You take your preferred one,
But
preferred number. So essentially, when I think of random numbers, I think of a big fat book. And in this big fat book, there are lots of numbers written. Yeah? And whenever you ask R to generate a random number, it'll go to this book. It starts somewhere in this book, and then it will read this book. And each random number that it has to generate, it just picks the next number in this book. And what setSeed does, it tells us where to start in this book. And since in theory this book, I mean, it's a funny book because once we reach the end, then you start again. Yeah, it's like people who read Finnegan's Wake for 20 years and then they come back and start again. So it's a bit like that with the random number book, which is normally so big that you don't get periodic things. But so in a way, the random numbers in R, it's something that's completely deterministic. And the only thing why we don't get the same results when we run it twice is that the next time we run it R starts at a different place in this book. And now set seed tells us, I want you to start at this particular place. And so in theory, it shouldn't matter at all which number you pick, because it shouldn't. I mean, once you start picking the right seed to get the pattern you want, then something is off. Yeah? But for it to be reproducible, you need to set a seed. And I don't know why I used 23. Could be whatever. So, and then there is the more complicated function, which is calculating in a redistribution kernel, which is essentially saying what should happen when you're at a position where do we move next. And this redistribution kernel takes a certain number of arguments. The first is the model from which we want to simulate. The second one is where do we get the environmental information from? And then we need to tell it where to start. Yeah, what's the first step? And I typically just take the first observed step of Scylla, and then we simulate from there, so that we start at the right point with the right direction, and then the rest is up to the simulator. Yeah? And then we say that the landscape in principle is continuous, so it'll give us a point somewhere in this landscape, even if the map is obviously not continuous, but we want a point somewhere on this map, so we don't want to have it two grid cells. And then this is the tolerance outside. We talked about this earlier. What happens when your proposal points are outside of your landscape? And here I give it quite a high tolerance, because the simulator will stop when essentially you find yourself in a corner and everything it tries to propose is outside the area where you have environmental information. We don't want to have as an outcome a raster, but rather individual point locations. And this is the number n control is the number of proposal steps out of which one step is chosen then to be our realized step. And here I would put in quite a high number so that we have a good chance of finding a point, a realized step that corresponds to this landscape. If you have very few proposed steps that you suggest here, then the simulator might, because it has to choose one of the ones that you propose. Imagine you propose only one. That would be the most extreme case. Even if that was a super crappy area that you proposed, it would have to go there. Yeah? And if you just propose 10, it might pick, all these 10 might be crappy. So example, if you're in a landscape where there's just one cool path, you need a lot of points so that to make sure that the simulator can find that cool path.
Sorry, I thought it was easy.
Thank you. Could you just explain tolerance again? So is it, if I'm understanding it, if the step is trying to step outside of the grid that we've given it, the model, if it's a high tolerance, the model can kind of cope with that and sort of makes its way back. And if it's a low tolerance, it breaks a little bit if it reaches the corner.
Yeah, so it will just say
I can't
so,
do it.
so we've made a step here. Yeah. So this is start step. And now we ask the redistribution kernel to give us 1,000 potential steps. So we get 1,000 points here. Yeah. Very, very many. And the few will be outside. And this is the tolerance that we accept. How many proposals do we accept that for what, I mean, they could also be inside, but they're NAs. Yeah, if our map has, so we had this idea that there could be a coastline here. Yeah, if we now would be in an area where or a lot of proposal steps would be outside, then this is perhaps an indication that something's weird here. So we are in an area that is so constrained spatially that something might be wrong. And that is why Johannes put that in there. I think I'm not too nervous about this, so that's why I cranked it up to 20%, and that typically works so far for me. So the idea is that you might find yourself in a part of the landscape where you cannot expect the model to work properly anymore, because it's too much constrained by the lack of information.
So I think I need help understanding the end control, like these points that you're generating.
Yeah.
In the model itself, I understand why we chose those. It seems like this function is using the model to predict where the animal will go, but I don't understand what these control points are. What's the point of them?
Yeah. Earlier we needed the control points to say there it went and it could have gone there.
Yeah.
Now, in simulating forward, we have to tell the model where it could go.
Okay.
And these points from which it selects one, those are the 1,000 there. So we again, like earlier for each step we threw in 200 points where it could have gone.
Yeah.
Now we throw in 1,000 and it'll pick one of these.
And how does it pick that one? Is it like, are there 1,000 plausible points?
There are 1,000 points. These points come again from the same proposal distribution that we used to fit the model. Okay. Then we calculate for each of these points what our movement model says how probable it is to move there.
Yes.
So we get, in this case, 1,000 predictions how probable it could be to move there, and then it's picking one out of these 1,000 according to the probability of picking that one according to the model.
So it's the point with the highest probability?
Not necessarily, because it's, we then use the random number generator, and it is most likely that it goes to the point with the highest. The point that has the highest probability has the one that's the highest probability to be chosen. But I mean, if you even if you have a biased coin, if there were only 2 points, just to mention I said n control 2, and one had 90% and one 10%, then still in 10% of the cases I would go to this.
Okay. So it's a random, it's a probabilistic selection.
Yeah, it's a exactly.
Okay.
It's weighted by the posterior probability from the model. So each of these points gets a posterior probability based on the fitted model, and then it will use that probability as a weight to pick randomly.
Okay.
So you're more likely to take a like to a preferred location, but it's not, because otherwise it would always be optimal.
Sure. Yeah. All right.
And because of that, we need to, because it could be that there is just one patch that is super attractive, and if we have only 10 points that we randomly select, so the animal is here, and this here is the super cool spot, and when you remember these funny landscapes initially with the movement kernel overlaid on this landscape when there was a strong selection. There was these 4 images. And now we have a landscape that is very heterogeneous, so that the animal should actually go, almost certainly go there. The simulator can only make the animal go there if there is one of our control points, our proposal points, is in this spot. That's why we need to have lots of them, because otherwise, just by chance, it's going to miss it. Yeah? So then what would happen is that our simulated path doesn't actually represent what the model says the animal should do. Because we approximate we could take all the landscape each time, but that would be very costly. So instead of the whole landscape, we say, well, let's look at what could be 1,000, 10,000 potential steps. For each of these steps, we can calculate the relative probability according to the model that the animal goes there. And then once we have these relative probabilities, we just pick one of them according to these probabilities. Yeah, it's a bit a similar problem that we had earlier. So in a way, it's a numeric approximation to the potential steps, and the more you throw in there, the better the path that will be simulated reflects what the model says should be happening. But then you might also want to have a longer path simulated. So it's a question of where do you put your computational power. So what this K1 does, K1 is capable of telling us, once I'm here now, where do I go next? And then simulate path just iterates this thing as many times as we want it. Oh. This is just a little helper function for plotting to help with the plotting. So it calculates the spatial extent of my simulated track. And this is now Scylla overlaid on elevation, and I think the first step is somewhere here, and then it does this thing. And if you wanted to know what happens in the long term with Scylla, we'd have to simulate for a long time, and then we would get the utilization distribution. In this model, we do not yet have home ranging behavior. Yeah? So that would mean that the model will, the animal will try to, or it will try to, it will eventually, it would leave our area. And that's why we now will add to our model the home ranging behavior. And this comes back to what we did with the RSF. So this is exactly the kind of additional variables that we need to simulate home ranging in the RSF or in the SSF. So that's now the same idea. And there are just three additional variables that we need. The x-coordinate of the end of the step, the y-coordinate of the end of the step, and the sum of the squared coordinates. And the parameter estimates that we get for this is then related to the size of the home range, and the parameter related to this are then related to where is the center of the home range. Oh ja. Danke. Yes.
Is there a reason why the water distance is back in this model for the M_HR?
No.
Okay.
No, this is just to confuse you. No. That's this. Earlier we didn't have water distance. What did we have? Is it mean NDVI and? No, is it like this? It's I think it's like this, no? That? Let's see whether it works. No.
There is an underscore between mean and NDVI.
Ah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. What I think is missing here, and I should put in there sort of a function to calculate then really the home range center and the home range size based on these parameter estimates. I'll put that in there and update the code. Yeah. To do add code to calculate home range center and size. For now, all we do is we simulate from the model. And although the model is in a way conceptually quite a bit more complex, for us nothing has changed. Yeah? We just add the formula for including the home ranging behavior, and then automatically the simulate function knows what to do. Because we are using only predictors that are anyway calculated by the function that by the redistribution kernel. It anyway adds the information on what's the coordinates of the endpoint. And here, one thing. So far we plotted the track on top of the one variable, environmental variable. Here we now plot it on top of the selection map. I suggest we take one more thing, the barriers, and then we call it a day. Yeah, it's 5, it's Friday. It's raining. Well, then we can go on. So barriers. So the first thing that the easy way to take into account barriers in the step selection function is that you somehow have a landscape where you are in one piece of the landscape or in another piece of the landscape. So we first create here a landscape where this is the case. I'll show you how this looks like. Yeah. So there are 5 parts of this landscape, and the more interesting part for us is the part down below here. And now we can ask in the model for a given point, am I in the same habitat class at the end of the step as I am now, as where I am now? Because if I'm on the same habitat class, if I start in blue and end in blue, then I didn't cross the river. That's the assumption. We all know that there could be an area where you do this. Yeah? So there could be unobserved double crossings. That could happen. But the logic is that this is sufficiently rare to be not a problem. So we ask ourselves, to what extent can we predict that once the animal is here, it will not be there at the end of the step? Yeah, that's the kind of variable we create here. And how do we tell this?
Sorry, just a question. What you just mentioned now, that it's quite rare that, well, at the beginning of the step and at the end of the step is in the same but passing outside. If I have, by any chance, a polygon that goes a little bit pointing inside, that could be what happens. No.
It could happen.
Okay.
Sure. It could happen that, that's where the super high resolution data and dead reckoning come in, where you then know.
Yeah.
Because that would be another way, at least for the realized steps, you could then say I crossed or I didn't cross.
Yeah. But could I say that if it's crossing to pass by the shorted path, is it possible to somehow model? If I'm really sure that it cannot pass through. So let's say there is really a fence and, I don't know, it's 20 meters high. Would it be possible in any way to model so that it touch and makes like the shorted path but passing inside?
What I would do in that case, at least for the fitting process, I would calculate these are my alternative points here, right? And here's this barrier. The arm is a barrier. So to go from there to there, I'm saying it's not actually doing this, it's actually going up around. So then what you could do is you could calculate the shortest path from there to there that is not crossing this. So this would be some GIS magic that you'd have to do. Yeah, but that's how I would do this. But then you're not actually trying to find out whether it's crossing or not. You're saying it's not crossing, and this point is now to get there. It has to do this. So the cost of movement, which is in this case then the distance, is this. So you would have to incorporate it like that, and then in the simulations that would be a bit more tricky. But yeah.
But Björn, isn't it all point based? So it doesn't matter if you join with the segment line two locations in a straight line and it crosses, even though it went around, because you're only taking into account the environment of the two locations and not of the line connecting them? Or did I miss something?
I mean, from what I understood, you would have here a case where you can go from there. You could go around this, so it was not really in like here that you have to cross it anyway to get to this point.
Sure, but if you have like, so if you join your points with lines, it seems like, because it's the shortest connection, that it was crossing something, but actually like in the model it only takes the raster values of the points, so it doesn't matter how these points are connected with a line, right?
Well, normally we make the assumption that it doesn't matter, but here we think it really matters, and then we have to tell the model that the distance between these points is not the shortest path distance.
Okay, I see.
So that you'd have to.
But it wouldn't. But if you don't. But if you are just taking into account points, and both points are like in the blue region, even though the line, because like on the top there, you could put the 1 point left and right, and the line connecting the 2 points would be going through the green, but actually both points are in the blue. So the model would recognize that as not crossing.
Yes.
Okay.
In this case, yeah. In this particular version of the model, it would assume that when it goes from there to there, that it does not cross into the green and comes out.
Was that kind of your question?
Yes, but
Okay.
then it means that then I'm not simulating correctly. Because
But the simulation is what he was saying, that's a tricky one. But I was like
exactly. I was just wondering if there was any way to say, well, if by any chance, yes, I have my simulated step length and it falls within the raster that I like, it's okay. But if, I don't know, my step length goes through a part that it shouldn't, I should avoid that point.
Yeah. I mean, if the green was going really thin in here.
Exactly, that's
then,
my...
And would stop here, then from both pieces would be in the green, in the blue, and we would still expect that the animal is not going over there.
Exactly.
And how do you take that into account? So then one thing that you could do is you calculate for each point in the blue what is the actual distance in terms of pixels to get there.
Exactly.
So that's something that, but the GIS, I mean, it's easy to calculate in terms of what you have to write, but this distance or this layer you have to calculate for each step, because depending on where you are, the costs are different. But it's doable. It's
because I was
doable.
imagining, for example, an highway, and the highway may go there, but then go in a tunnel. So there is the passage along the way, but for a long time it's a linear, clear blockage.
Yeah, I mean, if any one of you has this problem, then I'd be happy to next week to think about how to do this. But it's always doable, but a little more complicated than here.
Maybe a solution for that, as you're mentioning that there's a passage, maybe you can create a raster that has the values of like allowed points on both sides, and you have in the raster the division, and just create the points of passing, and that way you can model the step selection around it. So we'll be creating that raster that tells you there's the barrier that will be values that you are not allowed to take, and then the connection points, but have those connection places as an allowed in the raster. So it will be like the creation of that raster that allows you to model in that way. Would that be possible.
I see that you can have a raster layer where you say you can't go there. But it still could, I mean, the animal could go there, but it's just not doing it because the way is so long. No?
Exactly, because you are still modeling that there is a movement until it gets to a passage point. So you, in the raster, you have these areas not allowed, but there's this point that you will be able to cross. Because here you're just putting river on the like you cannot cross the river.
Yeah.
But maybe you can be on both sides, but there's places for passing in the
I mean,
raster.
here, I mean, I'm just saying this is one side of the river, this is the other. I'm not saying you can't cross.
Yeah.
This is what I'm estimating, because it could be that, and I mean, that this is permeable. Yeah. I mean, if this was a road now, or I mean, I guess buffaloes, depending on the river, they would cross it. You know, it's not that they can't cross any river. And then you would see that sometimes they go here and do not cross, and sometimes they would cross. And we would estimate here now to what's the probability that you cross the river. And this could be something that is very low, but not really zero. Whereas here, in our case, the buffalo does not cross once. So the model will be estimating something saying, oh, you really, really do not cross.
Okay.
But if it was sometimes crossing, then this would be perfectly fine. And we would know to what extent it is avoiding crossing. And I mean, this is here what we, how we express the idea that you cross or don't cross. I mean, you say, what's the probability? So our explanatory variable is that at the end of the step, I'm not in the same environment as at the start. Yeah. So is for this step, is it the case that I start in the blue and end in the green? In this case, that conditions would be true, or is it I'm in the same, then this condition would be false. I mean, this all comes down to saying sometimes you need to do a bit of GIS magic to express your idea of what resources do to the movement.
Sure.
Yeah? Because some people also prefer not to calculate what's at the end, but really calculate somehow the cost along the path. Yeah, that would also be, I mean, you can be very creative to describe what happens between here and over there. And we now, because the animal never crossed, the parameter estimate for crossing is something, well, do we see this here? So we get this. It's rather large, so it's 600. Yeah, so the no, this is standard deviation. Where are we? That's coefficient. So it's minus 16. So it's really not crossing. So if the point, it's true that it's not the same land, that I'm not on the same side of the river, then this will really get a very low value of probability. And then again, we can simulate from this. And now the simulated Scylla will not cross any longer in this part of the landscape. There are still a few things that look very different. What things do you see that are different from in the red relative?
The simulated one crosses that really high bit in the middle,
Here.
which I'm guessing is something to do with like maybe the length of the step or something. It's just not, it's too big a resolution to be able to pick up
Yeah.
that very high bit in the middle.
Yeah. So exactly. So the step length on the 3 hours are such that this is not a long distance in terms of what could happen in 3 hours, and it wouldn't put a point here because that's too high, but here it's again low. So in order, so how could we deal with this? I mean, how could we try to bring this into our model? So what is this? What characteristic has this step that we feel shouldn't be allowed?
Its ability to cross that landscape.
Its ability to cross the landscape. So what feature is it that we? I mean, if we now have to calculate something, what could be the quantity that we think is not allowed? The elevation itself, there's fine. What's
the elevation in the trajectory. I mean, in that track between the 2 points.
Yeah.
And that's
I mean, we had discussed this at some point about these energy landscapes. So a fancy way would be that for each point, for each potential step, you calculate the energetic cost, and that would be a very high energetic cost to do this. And then this would, if you had that as energetic cost of the step as an explanatory variable, then it wouldn't do this. A simpler way could be that for each step you, and I think AMT even offers you the opportunity to extract not only what happens at the beginning, at the end, but what happens, say, at 10 points in between. And then you calculate from that the variance or sort of you could do the sum of absolute changes in elevation. So you calculate a proxy of the costs and take that. Yes, that would be possible, and then this shouldn't happen. Yeah.
Then maybe we can use the same. If I can extract that values and I have a polygon that is maybe my railway or whatever it is, and if I can extract the points, I can say then in the model, if it's one of the point in my trajectory as a value of 1 that says it's a road, then discard that trajectory.
Or you have that as an explanatory variable. Is there at least 1 point?
Yeah, exactly. At least 1 point, discard that. Okay.
Yeah.
So previously in the lecture, you referred to beaming of individuals. Is this what you meant?
Exactly. So this is now we see that our simulated animal beams itself across something where it shouldn't do this, and then we thought, okay, how can we tell this model that it shouldn't beam? So how do we characterize the costs along the path between 2 points? Yeah. So we're trying here to deal with the fact that the model normally doesn't see things that are small elements between them.
Okay, and I'm not following how you would penalize that then. Like, how do you calculate the cost and incorporate that into the model?
So one thing could be for each of our 200 alternative steps, right? I mean, you would not only look at what is the elevation here, or what is the difference in elevation between start and end, but you would calculate what is the cumulative sum of absolute changes in elevation along this step, along this path. Yeah. So and sort of, and that would be a measure of how much work you have to do to get to the other side, and then you use that as a predictor in the model.
Okay.
Yeah. So you create predictors that are calculated based on what happens along the shortest path between these points. You can then go even, I mean, you can go crazy, and instead of having the shortest path, you can calculate other things, that more complicated things, but that are not implemented in AMT, so that would be a bit more work. So the general idea would be create additional predictors that are calculated based on points along the shortest path between two locations. .520, I think that, I think we can stop here. There is more code for in particular for having multiple animals in either RSF or SSF. And if that is something that you want to work on with your animals, then next week would be the time, and we can discuss this in detail. If there are several people, we can then make a small session where we go through that exactly, and so on. Yeah. But now from my side, it's weekend.